Tony Abbott's new Australian government is putting roads and other projects at home above foreign assistance, foreshadowing what is effectively a cut of more than $4 billion in the aid budget. So far, there are no details, but the island nations of the Pacific are particularly concerned about how they will be affected. Dr. Jimmie Rodgers is the Director General of the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, the region's largest scientific and technical organisation, which receives Australian support for its health, education and development programs. Jimmie Rodgers, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
The new Australian government and its predecessor both raided the aid budget. How worried are the small nations of the Pacific about the consequences or the possible consequences of these cuts into the future?
Yeah, well, I think the first reaction is there would be some concern, but looking through the statements from the government where they are putting a focus on Asia Pacific and retaining the 12-13 levels, I think a combination of those two are reassuring for Pacific countries, I would say, and definitely for organisations like the SPC.
You are in Canberra at the moment. Have you been able to get any specific reassurance from the people within the Australian government you've been speaking to about your budget, which is heavily underpinned by Australia?
Well, I think at this point in time, the people that we speak with are also themselves trying to find out exactly what the issues will be. But I think the assurance that they have given us really is because of the increased focus on Asia Pacific that we probably shouldn't be looking at too much of a change. I'm hoping that is the case for the Pacific generally and regional organizations like SPC in particular. I'm waiting to hear, I guess, as this thing further unfolds. Australia has been a very committed government. They were our founding members. They are our major partner, and they finance particular programs through regional organizations and many through SPC, where the impacts at the national level are very clear. So I can't see those important programs being, if you like, forgotten. So we're very hopeful, put it that way.
What would any sort of cut do to the kind of work that you've been doing? What kinds of programs would have to be curtailed if there were any sort of cut in real terms in Australian funding of the Secretariat?
Yeah, I think the first point to make is that we only provide services that countries themselves either have no capacity to do, or that they make sense from a regional perspective because of economies of scale. And in that context, because we cover something like 20 sectors at the SPC work program, whatever the cut will be will entail us having to choose which of the programs we may have to put on hold, which of the programs we may have to curtail, and which of the programs we run with. Some of the important programs, for instance, statistics, that is mostly supported by Australia, and that program is the one that actually helps measure development progress in the Pacific. The data, the MDG tracking, very, very important program, and it's a small team that we have with a lot of work. The Oceanic Fisheries Program, for instance, that does the tuna tagging and provide the science where decision making is done at other fora, is another good example of a very important program. And so it's got to be very difficult for us if we were faced with a situation that we have to curtail some of our programs, and that's something that we'll have to wait and see before making those decisions.
I wonder whether it's worth making this point too, is that the programs that you've mentioned all would appear to have some side benefits for Australia itself too.
I think the important thing in most of the programs we run and are funded by Australia, in fact, are of interest to Australia. The fisheries program, for instance, is a very important one because it does provide Australia with the same scientific information that is provided to other countries that they can use for their own planning purposes, as well as positioning at meetings such as those of the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission. There are programs that we run, for instance, in maritime security, that are very, very important because it protects borders, and the Pacific being what it is, 98% ocean, we do provide some services in the maritime sector that looks at, for instance, controlling ships might come over. So many of the programs that are in the Pacific are, yes, of direct interest to Australia.
Maritime security is, of course, of great significance and of great interest within Australia. In your speech to the National Press Club, you reminded us that the population of the Pacific is projected to double in the next half century. What are the implications of that, given that the micronations, the small nations of the Pacific, are struggling already to provide for the populations they have?
I think the implications will really draw on the type of hard questions that leaders of today need to ask. And those questions will relate to, for instance, what policy options do we think about now to position our countries better? We know there are certain things we are not able to control. We cannot control the land area that these countries have. It will remain the same or decrease. We cannot really control the growth in population. Those two are given. We cannot really control the way in which fisheries resources will start to decline. And therefore, the whole issue becomes one of what are the policy options. And in particular, when you look at microstates, there is not too much of an option because unlike the larger island countries in Melanesia, they cannot really diversify too much, say, in food security on aquaculture because that's one of the options on fisheries.
If there are not too many policy options for these very small nations, even though their populations will be growing quite radically over the next few years, does that mean that the big nations of the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand in particular, have to be prepared to take more migrants from these nations if they cannot feed themselves?
Yeah, there is a lot of pride in sovereignty. Many countries in the Pacific would prefer to keep their people, and many people would prefer to remain within. Ultimately, I think that question might be broached by some countries earlier than others. There have been some discussions between one or two Pacific Island countries on issues such as potential relocation, and therefore I think some countries are already on the front foot of looking at options long term. But I think that will become more and more a necessity as we progress the next 2 to 3 decades, because some of the changes will manifest themselves a lot more in the next 20 years or so.
Jimmie Rodgers, we'd better leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.